Why did you hide it?
Because loving you is forbidden.
Not to your queen. What did you see?
Every night, your mind calls my name.
I never wanted you to know. Did Earth follow you?
They didn't come for me.
Then they came for my throne.
The ceremony had started 4 minutes early, and Ethan Morrow had learned, in 3 years aboard the Vorath Kayan, that nothing the Arvakai did was ever accidental. He stood at the back of the observation tier, with the other non-Arvakai dignitaries, 47 beings representing 11 species, arranged by height per Arvakai protocol. This put Ethan near the middle of the row, shorter than the Trithani crystalline delegates, taller than the 6-limbed Prath trade envoys who hummed faintly when nervous. They were very nervous today. So was Ethan. He had learned, over 3 years, to express this in exactly 0 observable ways. Below the observation tier, the throne hall of the Vorath Khan stretched for half a kilometer, its ceiling lost in engineered dark. The floor was black polished stone, shipped from the Arvakai home system, a planet Ethan had seen only in photographs. A world of dark oceans and pale continents, nothing like Earth, nothing like anywhere he'd ever been. Thousands of Arvakai military personnel stood in formation below, silver-skinned, bioluminescent patterns dormant along their arms and necks, a stillness so complete it made a human crowd at attention look chaotic by comparison. Grand Arbiter Velthos stood at the central dais. Ethan had met Velthos exactly once, during the initial protocol exchange 6 months prior. The Grand Arbiter was Trithani, one of the silicon-based species that had held seats at the top of conclave hierarchy for 11,000 years. He stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, his body a lattice of interlocked crystalline structures that caught light and distributed it wrong, just slightly wrong, in a way that made human eyes want to look elsewhere. His voice, when he spoke, bypassed the air entirely and registered directly as vibration in the bones. The Conclave Galactic convenes under the neutral accords, Velthos said, and the room felt the words rather than heard them. This session is designated a suitability review. Subject species, Terran humanity. Classification pending. All present parties are recognized as witnesses. No one moved. Suitability review. It was a term Ethan had found in Conclave archives 3 weeks ago, buried under 6 layers of bureaucratic classification. He had translated it himself, cross-referenced it against 17 other galactic legal frameworks, and then sat with the result for 2 days before writing his report to Earth Command. Suitability review meant someone had formally moved to reclassify humanity as a Grade 5 liability. Grade 5 liability meant extermination protocol. He had not included that last part in the report to Earth Command. Not because he was trying to protect them, because his report was probably being read by the same people who had sent him here without asking whether he wanted to go. And he had decided some time ago that he was tired of doing their worrying for them. Velthos continued. The formal review period will commence in 72 hours. Parties wishing to submit evidence for or against reclassification will do so through the Conclave Secretariat. The threshold for reclassification is a 2/3 majority vote of the full Conclave Assembly, currently comprising 41 member species. 41 species. Humanity was not one of them. Humanity had been a provisional observer status species for 19 years, long enough to be present at these events, not long enough to vote on its own survival. Ethan did the math again.
The same math he'd been doing for 3 weeks.
2/3 of 41 was
28 votes. He knew the positions of maybe 14 delegations well enough to guess, and even his most optimistic estimate put 11 of those 14 in the yes column.
Yes to extermination. He was thinking about this specifically. He was cataloging the words he would need to report this to Earth Command in a way that was factually accurate without being the kind of thing that caused immediate mass panic when Queen Jarael entered the throne hall. She came through the high doors at the far end, flanked by 8 Arvakai guards in formal white, and the room changed in the specific way that rooms change when the person everyone has been waiting for finally arrives. Ethan had witnessed this entrance 100 times in 3 years. It never got less effective. Jarael of the Arvakai was tall, even by Arvakai standards, nearly 2 meters, silver-skinned like all her kind, but her bioluminescent markings were different from the standard pattern. Most Arvakai had those patterns running along the arms and jaw. Hers traced the sides of her neck and down across her collarbone and disappeared beneath the formal mantle she wore, which was the deep green-black of space between star systems. Her eyes were amber, faceted, the kind of eyes that made you aware you were being processed rather than merely seen. In 3 years, Ethan had never seen her bioluminescence shift in public. Not once. She had the kind of control over her own physiology that a trained musician might have over their breathing, complete, habitual, and invisible, unless you were looking for the effort behind it. He watched her walk to the dais and take her position adjacent to Velthos, representing the Arvakai Empire's witness capacity, and he thought briefly, quietly, in the specific way he had learned to think about such things over the past 18 months, that she looked tired today. Not visibly. Nothing as legible as that. But he had spent 3 years watching her in rooms, and he knew the difference between her stillness when she felt it and her stillness when she was performing it. Today was performance. Something was weighing on her that she was not letting the room see. He noticed this, cataloged it, and put it in the same box where he kept everything else he'd noticed about her over 3 years. The box was getting full. He was good at packing things in tightly. That was when the proximity sensor on his diplomatic band vibrated. Ethan glanced at it. A single line of Arvakai text, which he read without needing to translate anymore. Biometric anomaly registered. Origin, human, diplomatic attaché, Tier 4. Classification, non-transactional emotive bond. Flag status, unprecedented. Medical monitoring initiated. He looked up. He looked at Jariel standing 200 meters away, not looking at him. And he understood, with a calm that surprised him, that whatever had just been detected had been read by the room itself, by the passive biometric grid, the Arvakai, embedded in every public space, the way humans embedded security cameras, and that the information had gone somewhere, and that somewhere included the Queen's own data stream. His first thought was, of course. His second thought was, after 3 years, I got careless. His third thought, which arrived approximately 6 seconds later, quiet and without particular drama, was, she knows. The ceremony continued. Velthos outlined the procedural timeline. The Prath envoys hummed their anxious note. The Trithani delegates stood motionless as furniture. Ethan kept his breathing even and his expression neutral, and thought about absolutely nothing at all for 47 minutes, which was how long the opening session lasted. When it concluded, the tier began to empty. Other dignitaries moved toward the exits, some already speaking in low, urgent voices. The math of 41 votes was apparently not lost on anyone else either. Ethan moved with them, the flow of bodies carrying him toward the main corridor. He had almost reached the exit when a figure stepped neatly into his path. She was young by Arvakai standards. Ethan estimated 60 Earth years, somewhere in their early adulthood, with the formal white mantle of a senior palace attaché. Her bioluminescence pulsed once in clear blue, which he recognized as the Arvakai equivalent of a formal announcement. Cultural attaché Moro, she said in accented but precise English. The Arvakai had collectively decided, some years back, that it was more efficient for their diplomatic staff to learn human languages than the other way around. Ethan had mixed feelings about this. You are requested by Her Majesty. A pause. Immediately. Ethan looked at the other departing dignitaries, looked at the exit, looked back at the attaché. All right, he said. She led him through corridors he knew past the diplomatic archive, past the secondary audience chamber, and then through a left turn he had never taken. He knew every right turn on this level. He had mapped the ship in his head the way he mapped everything. Methodically. Because knowing where he was had always felt important in a way that probably said something unflattering about his psychology. The left turn led into a corridor that was subtly different. The floor was the same dark stone, but the walls were inlaid with a material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. And there was no hum from the ventilation system that ran through the rest of the ship. It was very quiet. The attaché stopped at a threshold. Not a door. Ethan didn't see any mechanism, just a border between the corridor and what lay beyond it, marked by a shift in the light. A faint shimmer, like the edge of a soap bubble made of something with actual weight. The royal veil. He recognized it from the architectural schematics he'd studied when first assigned to the Vorath Kayan. No non-Arvakai had ever been permitted past it. That was not a rule that had been explained to him as a prohibition. It was simply a fact. The way boiling points and light speeds were facts. It hadn't occurred to him to try. The threshold is calibrated for your biometric signature, the attaché said. You may pass through without harm. She paused. The Queen asks that you leave your diplomatic recorder in my custody. Ethan unclipped the recorder from his collar and handed it over without argument. Whatever was about to happen, he was fairly sure that a record of it would not serve him well. He stepped through the veil. The sensation was brief and strange, a moment of pressure across his whole body, like the surface tension of very cold water, and then he was through, and the corridor on the other side was different. Warmer. The walls had a faint luminescence of their own, not the embedded lighting of the diplomatic sections, but something more organic, something that felt like it came from the material itself, rather than from anything installed in it. The air carried a scent he had smelled before, but only faintly, in passing. Something between salt water and cool stone, the signature flora of the Arvakai home system, filling these private spaces with the smell of a planet that was very far away. On this side of the veil, that scent was clear and constant, and nothing like the recycled diplomatic quarter air he'd been breathing for 3 years. Jarael was at the end of the corridor. She was not on a throne. She was not in a formal posture. She was sitting on the floor. The word didn't quite capture what Arvakai bodies did when they lowered themselves, but the effect was the same, with a holographic display spread around her in a 3-meter arc. The display showed Earth, not a tactical map, not a resource chart. Earth as seen from orbit, the blue-white swirl of cloud systems, the brown and green of continents, the glitter of city lights on the dark side. She had rotated it to the Pacific hemisphere, and she was studying the coastlines with the focused attention of someone who had been doing it for a while. She looked up when he entered. Her expression and the Arvakai had expressions, a smaller and more subtle vocabulary of them than humans did, but legible to him now after 3 years was composed. Neutral. But her bioluminescence, which was always flat and controlled in public, shifted fractionally at his arrival, a barely perceptible pulse of gold along the line of her jaw that faded almost before it appeared. He had never seen gold before. He didn't know what it meant. "Attache Moro," she said. "Your Majesty." He stopped a few feet from the edge of the display. "That's the Oregon coast." A pause. "It is." He'd recognized it immediately, the specific curve of the coastline north of the Columbia River mouth, the way the light fell on what would be Portland's outer suburbs. He had grown up there. He had not included that in his diplomatic profile because it hadn't seemed relevant. "How long have you known?" he asked. She didn't ask what he meant. The Arvakai and Jarael in particular had a strong preference for not performing confusion they didn't feel. "The passive biometric grid has been reading your physiological data for 3 years," she said. "Tonight's reading was flagged because the signal strength exceeded the threshold that triggers automated review." A pause. The specific classification, non-transactional emotive bond, has never before been registered from a non-Arvakai source. Ethan thought about that for a moment. "Never," he said. "Never in recorded Arvakai history." He looked at the image of the Oregon coast rotating slowly in the holographic display. He thought about the dog he'd had growing up, a border collie named Meridian, and how some time ago he had mentioned it in passing to a junior attaché in what he'd believed was an entirely casual conversation. He thought about how the Arvakai categorized information. He thought about what passive biometric data for 3 years actually meant in practice. Then he put all of that in a box, which was a skill he had developed young and refined extensively, and he said, "Why am I behind the veil?" Jarael rose. Not quickly, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who had learned that moving carefully projected more authority than moving fast. She closed the holographic display with a small gesture, and Earth disappeared, and they were standing in a warm corridor that smelled of another world, and she looked at him with those amber-faceted eyes. "Because what I need to discuss with you cannot be discussed anywhere the Conclave Secretariat monitors," she said. "And every public space on this ship is monitored by the Conclave Secretariat." A pause. As of tonight, they moved faster than expected. They always do. She turned and walked deeper into the corridor, and after a moment he followed. "The vote has been moved. You calculated 72 hours. The actual timeline is closer to 60. How do you know I calculated 72 hours? Because you are the only non-Arvakai diplomat on this fleet who reads Conclave legal archives in the original Trethani. And because the specific files you accessed 3 weeks ago were the correct ones." She stopped at an open doorway and gestured him through. You are very good at your job, Atash Morrow. Better than Earth Command understands. The room beyond was not a throne room. It was a working space, a large table covered in holographic displays showing conclave documents, voting histories, and species dossiers. A chair on one side. On the other, a long, low surface with a slight curve that would suit an Arvakai body, which he recognized as their equivalent of a couch. She settled onto it. He took the chair. You need something from me, he said. Yes, and it's related to the vote. It is the vote. She folded her hands, a gesture he recognized as preparatory. The Arvakai equivalent of taking a breath before something difficult. I will be direct with you, because you have earned that, and because we have limited time. Every logical argument for humanity's preservation has been made. Every data submission, every historical parallel, every predictive model. They have failed. Her eyes met his. The Grand Arbiter's position is supported by too much precedent and too much arithmetic, so humanity loses. Not necessarily. She paused. There is one category of evidence that conclave law requires to be weighed equally with empirical data, demonstrated relational capacity. Evidence that a species has formed bonds with other recognized galactic species that transcend transactional benefit. A pause. The law exists because the conclave once nearly exterminated the Lathali, who later proved to be the most consequential diplomatic species in galactic history. I'm not familiar with the Lathali. You wouldn't be. They died out 4,000 years ago from a plague that a conclave member world failed to report. The loss is considered, in retrospect, catastrophic. Her voice was perfectly level. The relational capacity provision was added to conclave law 2,000 years ago. It has never been successfully invoked. Ethan looked at the document spread across the table. He could read fragments from where he sat. Conclave case law, invocation thresholds, evidence classification criteria. Never, he said. No species has ever produced evidence that met the standard, she said. The standard requires that the bond be genuine, involuntary in its origin, and verifiable by conclave truth assessment technology. Her eyes didn't move from his. Tonight's biometric reading meets all three criteria. The room was very quiet for a moment. You want me to stand in front of the conclave, Ethan said slowly, and let them scan my physiological data? Yes, and the data will show what it has always shown, she said. What the passive grid has been recording for 3 years. He looked at her. She was perfectly still, perfectly composed, bioluminescence flat and controlled. A queen making a proposal. He thought about what this would mean for his career, what Earth Command would say, what the 41 species in that hall would see when conclave truth scanners turned their instruments on a human diplomatic attaché and found a non-transactional emotive bond directed at the ruler of the largest military empire in the known galaxy. No, he said. She didn't flinch. She had probably anticipated that response. Your world ends in 60 hours, Ma. I know. You would let it end rather than... I would like to think about it, he said, rather than decide in the first 60 seconds of the conversation. He looked at the documents again. You said every logical argument has failed. What arguments did you make? A fractional pause. The gold pulse again, barely visible, there and gone. That is not relevant to what I'm asking. It's relevant to what I'm deciding. He met her eyes. What arguments did you make, Your Majesty? She was quiet for a long moment when she spoke. Her voice was the same level, precise, unhurried, but something in the rhythm had shifted slightly, some internal calibration she couldn't quite hide. I will answer that question, she said, but not tonight. Tonight. I need your answer. I said I need time to think. You have until morning. The Conclave Secretariat's daily monitoring sweep begins at what you would call 6 a.m. She stood, with that same deliberate, unhurried motion. One of my staff will bring you back to your quarters. In the morning, if your answer is yes, come to the veil threshold and request passage. If your answer is no, she stopped. Then I will have exhausted what can be done. He stood too, looked at her for a moment, the amber eyes, the silver skin, the bioluminescent patterns she kept so relentlessly still. You knew about the dog, he said. A pause. Attachmoro, my dog, Meridian. You had it in the biometric supplemental file. That information was not in any diplomatic record. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Good night, Attachmoro. He nodded. Good night, Your Majesty. He let the attaché lead him back through the veil, back through the familiar corridors, back to the diplomatic quarters he'd lived in for 3 years. He sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at the wall and thought about 60 hours and 41 votes. and what it felt like to have an impossible secret read by an ambient sensor array and then offered back to you as a legal instrument. He thought about Portland. He thought about what 60 hours from now would look like, and what the world after would look like, and what a world in which he had said yes would look like, versus one in which he had said no. He thought about her sitting on the floor in front of an image of the Oregon coast. He didn't sleep. Morning came as it always did on the Vorath Kayan, not as sunrise but as a gradual brightening of the artificial light that the Arvakai calibrated to their own biology, which ran on a slightly longer day cycle than Earth. Ethan had never fully adjusted. He was always awake before the lights changed. He sat at the narrow desk in his quarters and read through the conclave documents he'd collected over 3 weeks, not because they contained anything he didn't already know, but because organizing his thinking required a physical anchor. He worked methodically, voting records, historical precedents, species position statements. He rebuilt the arithmetic from scratch and got the same answer. 11 species would vote yes with certainty. 7 were unclear. The remaining 23 were distributed across positions ranging from procedurally opposed to extermination to enthusiastically supportive. Then he pulled up the conclave legal code, Section 14C of the Expanded Rights Framework, and read it again. Evidence of genuine interspecies relational bond may be submitted as mitigating evidence in any species review proceeding. To qualify, the bond must demonstrate non-transactional origin, meaning the bond was not formed in the context of a formal diplomatic or economic arrangement. B. Involuntary emotional component verified by recognized physiological assessment. And C. Cross-species nature involving at minimum one member species in good standing with the conclave. He sat back. The Arvakai were a member species in good standing. The passive biometric grid had been reading him for 3 years, which was before the formal review had been announced, which made the origin non-transactional by definition, and involuntary well. He had not chosen any of this. He was reasonably certain of that. He thought about what cross-species bond meant to 41 species watching conclave truth scanners parse his biometric profile. He thought about Earth Command, about Admiral Chen, who had briefed him before deployment with the specific words, maintain absolute professional distance. You are an observer. You are not a participant. About the 22 Earth government officials who monitored his quarterly reports. About the specific phrase relational entanglement that appeared in the Diplomatic Conduct Code, followed by the specific consequence, immediate recall and suspension of diplomatic status. He would lose his position. He might lose his clearance. He would certainly lose the respectful professional distance. That was the only thing standing between him and the full weight of what the last 3 years had actually been. He thought about 60 hours. He went to the Vale threshold at 7 in the morning. The same attaché was waiting, as if she'd been there since 6. She let him through without comment, through the warm amber light and the stone and salt water air, to the same working space. Jariel was already there. She had been working. The holographic displays showed updated conclave data, time-stamped from deep in the night. She closed them when he entered.
Yes, he said, before she could speak. She was quiet for a moment. Are you certain? No, he said.
But I've thought about the alternative, and I like it less. She nodded once. That was all. No expression of relief. He wasn't sure if relief was in the Arvakai emotional vocabulary, or rather, whether she would allow herself to show it. She moved to the table, and the displays reopened. Not Earth this time, but conclave procedural documents. We have approximately 53 hours, she said. In that time, we need to establish the parameters of the submission. The conclave truth assessment apparatus will verify your biometric data against the 3 criteria in Section 14C. The process takes approximately 4 minutes. She turned to look at him. During those 4 minutes, you will be fully exposed. Every member of the conclave assembly will have access to the raw biometric profile. What does that include? Cardiovascular data, hormonal levels, neurological activity patterns, behavioral response logs, a pause. Essentially, an annotated record of what your body has done in proximity to a specific stimulus over the past 3 years, and the stimulus being.
He didn't make it a question.
The stimulus being the queen of the Arvakai, yes. Her voice was perfectly even. She might have been discussing weather patterns. You should be prepared for the data to be comprehensive. How comprehensive? More than you would prefer. She looked at her display. However, the assessment apparatus does not produce a narrative. It produces classified data points. What the assembly will see is evidence of a bond, not a documentation of your private thoughts. That's comforting. It was intended to be practical, not comforting, I know. He sat down at the table. You said last night that you'd answer my question in the morning. She looked at him. What arguments did you make? He said. The logical ones, the ones that didn't work. A pause that lasted just long enough to tell him the question had weight. She turned back to the display and with a small gesture pulled up a document longer than anything else he'd seen on her table, a document whose header he could read from where he sat, time-stamped 3 years ago. The initial submission was a resource and capability analysis, she said, demonstrating that humanity's specific skill profile, creative problem-solving, adaptive technology, cross-discipline synthesis filled a gap in the current galactic market structure. She scrolled through it. The conclave rejected it on the grounds that humanity's volatility made the resource profile net negative. What was the second submission? She scrolled further. Historical parallel analysis. 42 previous species reviews, cross-referenced with long-term galactic stability outcomes. Species that had been cleared despite volatility flags showed, on average, a net positive contribution over 200-year periods. And that didn't work either. Velthas's team produced a counter-analysis showing that the 42 cleared species had significantly lower median emotional index scores than humanity. She closed the document. They have done their homework. Ethan looked at her. How many submissions? She didn't answer immediately. Your Majesty. How many submissions total? 47, she said. Submitted over a period of 3 years and 2 months, beginning 7 months after humanity was granted provisional observer status. He felt something shift in his chest. It was not a comfortable sensation. 7 months after, he said. That was before I was assigned here.
Yes, so you started before, yes.
He looked at the table, at the closed documents, at the corner of the room where the ambient light was slightly warmer, the way the light in the private quarters of this ship was always warmer, as if the Arvakai preferred the temperature of home even when they couldn't be there. Why? He said. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she was going to redirect the conversation. When she did speak, her voice had the same quality it had had the night before, perfectly controlled, but something slightly shifted in the rhythm beneath it. Because the arguments were correct, she said. Humanity's extinction would be a net loss to the galactic system. That assessment is accurate, independently of what the Conclave thinks. That's not why, he said quietly. The silence lasted 4 seconds. He counted. We have 53 hours, she said. There are procedural matters we should review. He let it go. He was a diplomat. He knew when to press and when to wait. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, the structure of the 14C submission, the format the Conclave truth assessment apparatus required, the likely counter-arguments Velthas would deploy and how to address them. She was precise and knowledgeable, and she answered every question he asked directly, except when they drifted toward the one he hadn't quite asked yet. Around what Ethan estimated was midday based on the light cycle. She brought him something to drink, a warm liquid the Arvakai made from a deep-sea kelp equivalent, which tasted nothing like tea but served the same cultural function. He had drunk it many times in diplomatic settings, but always from a server, never from her hand. He noticed the difference and put it in the box. He was working through the third procedural document when she said, without looking up from her own display, "There is one more thing you should know before the session." He looked up. The passive biometric data from the past 3 years will be presented in full, she said, not summarize the entire record. She looked up then and met his eyes, including my own data, where it overlaps with the proximity logs. He processed that. Your own biometric data. The Queen's biometric data is automatically recorded in the palace grid. If the two of us occupied the same space at any point, both records are present in the logs. A pause. The data will be presented as a paired record. That is how the 14C assessment works. What does your data show? He asked. Her bioluminescence pulsed gold again, the same brief flash as the night before, and then went flat. That is what the Conclave will determine, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She was already looking back at her documents. All right, he said, and went back to work. At what passed for late afternoon, she stood and said, You should return to your quarters and rest. The formal session Begins in 38 hours, she paused. I want to thank you for. Don't, he said, a pause. Attache Moro. I haven't done anything yet, he said. Thank me after if there's an after. She nodded once. The attaché appeared as if from nowhere and led him back through the veil. He walked the familiar corridors to his quarters. He sat at his desk. He did not write a report to Earth Command. He thought about 47 submissions, beginning 7 months before he arrived. He thought about gold bioluminescence that appeared and disappeared too quickly to read. He thought about what she had just told him, that her own data would be in that record too, that the apparatus would read them both simultaneously and display what it found to the full assembly. 3 years of paired proximity logs. He thought about this for a long time. Then the curfew light shifted, and he realized it had been 6 hours, and outside his window, the stars were doing what they always did, which was nothing but exist and be very far away, and he closed his eyes and tried to sleep. He almost managed it. The next 36 hours happened in the specific way that very important things happen slowly and all at once. Ethan went back through the veil in the morning, and they worked. In the afternoon, they worked more. In the evening, she insisted he eat dinner, which he did at the working table. Among the conclave documents, while she reviewed the latest position statements from the assembly members. He watched her read. She read the way she did everything efficiently, with minimal movement, her eyes tracking at a speed that reminded him that Arvakai cognitive processing handled information density tasks at roughly twice the human rate. He was watching her read when she looked up and said, "The Prath delegation shifted their position this morning. To yes, to undecided." She returned to the document. It is progress. How many undecided now? 9. The shift still leaves us short of the blocking threshold. She turned a page. But it is progress. He nodded and went back to his own documents and tried not to think about what he was actually doing, which was sitting in the private quarters of the Arvakai queen, eating something that tasted like a very competent approximation of rice, working on the legal case for his own species' survival, and feeling in the specific quiet way he had been feeling things for the past year and a half, completely and unreasonably at home. He put that in the box too. The box was running out of room. On the second afternoon, 20 hours before the formal session, she said, I need to walk you through what the truth assessment apparatus will feel like. It feels like something? For humans, yes. The apparatus uses electromagnetic pulse resonance to read biometric data at the cellular level. For silicon-based species, there is no sensation. For carbon-based biological species, she paused. It has been described as suddenly becoming aware of your own heartbeat. That sounds unpleasant. It is disconcerting, not painful. She looked at him steadily. The session will last 4 minutes. You should be prepared to feel exposed in a way that has no good human equivalent. I've already been exposed, he said. The grid has been reading me for 3 years. This will be different. The passive grid does not make you aware of what it records. The assessment apparatus will. He thought about this. Will you be scanned at the same time? Yes. The paired record requires simultaneous verification, so you'll feel it too. A pause. Yes. They looked at each other for a moment. Have you been through it before? He asked. No. All right, he said. What else do I need to know? She told him. They spent the next 2 hours going through every procedural element of the session, the order of proceedings, the timing, where he would stand, what he should and should not say if Velthos addressed him directly. She was thorough. She answered every question he asked and several he hadn't asked yet. He learned more about conclave procedure in those 2 hours than he had in 3 years of diplomatic study. At the end, she said, Is there anything you need from me that I have not provided? He almost didn't say it. He had been not saying it for 2 days, successfully and with considerable effort. Then he said it. You already knew about the biometric flag before the ceremony, he said. You told me the system flags things when signal strength exceeds the detection threshold. But I looked at the passive grid specifications. The threshold is calibrated for first detection. It only flags something once, the first time it appears in the record. He looked at her, which means the ceremony wasn't the first time. The system flagged it years ago, and you saw the report. She was very still. How long have you known? He asked. The silence was 4 seconds. 5, 6, 14 months, she said. He had estimated somewhere around that. He wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. He decided it didn't really matter either way and said, Okay. She looked at him. That is your response? What response would you prefer? Most beings, when informed that their
Uh.
private physiological data has been monitored and assessed without their knowledge, express something more than okay. I live in a foreign space fleet, he said. I've understood for 3 years that I have no privacy here. What would be the point of being angry about something I can't change? He paused. Is there a strategic benefit to anger from your perspective? No, she said. There is not. Right, he went back to his documents. So, they worked until midnight. He went back to his quarters. He slept 4 hours, which was more than the night before, and still not enough. On the morning of the session, 16 hours before it was scheduled, he returned to the Vale and requested passage. The attaché led him through. He walked into the working space and found Jarael standing at the display looking at a document he recognized, a conclave administrative record, time-stamped 3 hours earlier. She didn't greet him. She said, Velthos filed a supplemental submission this morning. He crossed the room to read it. The conclave's secondary evidence package was a behavioral analysis report, not biometric data behavioral observation logs from the past 3 years, compiled from public record cameras throughout the Vorathkayan's diplomatic sections. The report flagged 17 incidents in which human diplomatic staff had demonstrated what the Trethani analysis termed statistically anomalous emotional volatility, raised voices, physical gestures beyond standard diplomatic protocol, and one incident he recognized it immediately, in which a junior Earth attaché named Corporal Yuan had wept openly in a public corridor after receiving news of a family death. The report was meticulous. It was also, he realized as he read, specifically constructed around Corporal Yuan. The other 16 incidents were context. She was the case. He knows about Yuan, Ethan said. The behavioral pattern analysis targets her specifically. Velthus will argue that humanity's emotional responses are inherently disruptive to professional environments and therefore to stable galactic relations. She turned from the display. He will use her response to grief as evidence that humanity cannot self-regulate. They lost someone they loved, Ethan said.
Yes, and that's the argument, that losing someone you love
Love makes you dangerous.
it is the argument.
Her voice was flat. It is also, from a certain perspective. She stopped. Say it. From a certain perspective, not entirely without precedent. There have been cases in which species with uncontrolled grief responses have destabilized diplomatic processes. She looked at him carefully. I am not defending the argument. I am telling you what you will hear. Ethan looked at Corporal Yuan's behavioral file, 23 years old. Earth Command had assigned her to the fleet 4 months ago. She had cried in a corridor after her mother died. The conclave had turned it into a legal instrument. I need to talk to her, he said. Jariel looked up. Corporal Yuan is not, I know she's not involved in the 14C case. I'm not going to tell her about any of this. He looked at Jariel. She's going to see this report eventually. She needs to hear from someone that what she did was human and correct, and that the people using it against her are wrong. He paused.
I need to tell her that. Before the session.
She looked at him for a long moment, a look he couldn't fully parse. Something in the territory where Arvakai and human emotional vocabulary didn't quite overlap. Then she said, I will have my staff facilitate a meeting. Thank you. They looked at each other for another moment before she nodded and turned back to the display. He went to find Corporal Yuan. She was in the Earth Diplomatic Reading Room, a small space Earth Command had negotiated for during the original assignment setup, furnished with actual wood-based furniture shipped from Earth at considerable expense, which Ethan had always found both touching and slightly embarrassing. Yuan was reading something on her personal device, and she straightened immediately when he entered. Atash Morrow, she said. At ease, he said, which was not technically a phrase that applied to him, and they both knew it. But she relaxed anyway. How are you doing, Yuan? Fine, sir. A pause. Adapting. Good. He sat down across from her. I need to tell you something. You're going to hear it in a different context soon, and I'd rather you heard it from me first. He looked at her directly. The conclave has compiled a document. It references an incident from 2 months ago, when you received news about your mother. Her face went very still. They've included it in a behavioral analysis report, he said. I want you to know that the document is a deliberately misrepresentative piece of legal manipulation, and that the people who compiled it are arguing from a position of profound inability to understand what grief is. He paused. What you did was correct. What you felt was correct. And the fact that you felt it openly, in a corridor where anyone could see that is one of the things about humanity that is worth keeping. She was quiet for a long moment. He let the quiet sit. Is it going to hurt us? She said finally. The document, maybe, he said. I don't know yet. She nodded slowly. What happens if they vote yes? Then we go home, he said, or we try to. I haven't looked that far ahead. A pause. I'm told it won't come to that. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been 19 years old the first time they understood that the adults in charge were not necessarily in control. Told by who? Someone I trust, he said. She went back to her reading room. He went back through the veil. There were 14 hours left. He and Jarael worked through them mostly in silence, separately, reviewing documents and position statements, passing data between displays, and discussing strategy with the focused efficiency of people who had said most of what needed saying and were now doing the work. Twice she asked him questions. 3 times he asked her questions. A palace staff member delivered a meal that neither of them had requested. Because apparently there was someone on Jarael's household staff whose job was to monitor whether the queen had eaten and act accordingly. He was reviewing the 14C invocation precedents for the last time when he found it. It was not in the documents she had shown him. It was in a cross-reference, buried in a legal footnote in the Conclave archive, a note linking the 14C precedent case to an earlier administrative file. The earlier file was from 7 years ago. It contained a Conclave monitoring report, standard protocol for provisional observer species, automatically issued to all member species representatives, including the Arvakai representative. Jarael had received a Conclave monitoring report on humanity 7 years ago, a report that included, per standard protocol, a behavioral and cultural profile assessment of human diplomatic staff, including their known personal details. He sat back and looked at this for a long moment. 7 years ago, she had received a profile that described a cultural attaché named Ethan Morrow, including his childhood in Portland, Oregon, his education record, his psychological assessment, including the section marked significant personal attachments, which would have included a border collie named Meridian. He looked up from his display. She was across the room, reading something else, her bioluminescence perfectly controlled and still. He thought about the Oregon coast on the holographic display the first night behind the veil, the specific curve of the coastline north of the Columbia River, the section he'd grown up near. He thought about 47 submissions beginning 7 months after humanity's provisional observer status was granted. He thought about 14 months of known biometric data. He thought about the document he'd just found. 7 years ago. Your Majesty, he said. She looked up. The Conclave monitoring report from 7 years ago, he said. Standard issue for all member species.
You received it. A pause that was exactly the wrong length for someone who didn't know what he was referring to.
Yes, she said. You've known about me for 7 years. She looked at him steadily. Her bioluminescence did not move. You knew I would potentially be assigned here, he said. Not an accusation, just working through the shape of it. I knew that someone with your specific language and analytical profile was a candidate for the position, she said carefully. The decision was Earth Command's, but you didn't discourage the assignment. No, you could have. The Arvakai have veto authority over diplomatic staff assignments. Yes, you didn't use it. No, he nodded slowly. He looked back at his documents. He thought about this for a long time, in the way he thought about things that were too large to process, immediately not rushing toward an answer, just tracing the shape of the thing until it became familiar enough to hold. After a while, he said, "How much of this was planned?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was carefully level. The review was not planned. The conclave's timeline was not planned.
What I needed from you was not, she stopped. What I need was not something I anticipated when I reviewed your file 7 years ago.
But you reviewed the file. Yes, and you made a decision based on what you found. I made no active decision, she said.
I declined to act. That is different. In diplomatic practice, he said, declining to act is a decision. She looked at him. He looked back. Yes, she said, finally, it is.
The curfew light shifted. 3 hours to the session. You should rest, she said. I'm fine. You are human. You have had 4 hours of sleep in 2 days. You are not fine, and I need you functional for the next several hours. He almost argued. Instead, he said, Did you ever intend to tell me? She didn't answer right away. She looked at the display, which still showed the Conclave archive document he'd found, the monitoring report cross-reference with its 7-year-old timestamp. Then she looked at him, and the bioluminescence along her jaw shifted, not the brief gold flash, but something longer, something that lasted nearly 2 full seconds before she brought it back under control. I told myself, she said, that it was irrelevant. He nodded. He closed his display. He went to rest. The Conclave formal session chamber was located on the station adjacent to the Vorath Kayan, a neutral space, physically separate from any member species territory, which was why the Conclave used it. The transfer was via a sealed transit tube, pressurized to a standard atmospheric composition that was deeply uncomfortable for silicon-based species, slightly wrong for Arvakai, and fine for humans. Ethan had always found this quietly amusing, in the way that small ironies accumulate into something that feels almost like comfort over 3 years. He walked through the tube alongside 3 junior Arvakai diplomatic staff, who did not speak to him and who kept their bioluminescence flat and controlled. This struck him as unusual. The junior staff were normally more expressive, especially in stressful situations. They hadn't yet developed Jariel's complete physiological discipline. The fact that they were suppressing it now told him something about the stress level in the Arvakai, ranks that no one had put into words. The session chamber was vast in the way that spaces designed to make individuals feel small are vast. The ceiling disappeared into engineered altitude, and the acoustics were calibrated so that voices carried but footsteps didn't, which created the unsettling effect of sound existing only when it was meant to. The conclave assembly sat in tiered rings around a central floor, 41 species represented by their assigned delegations. The humans had a gallery position not tiered in the rings, not voting, present as witnesses to a proceeding about their own fate. Ethan found Corporal Yoon in the gallery, before he was directed to his waiting position. She gave him a small nod that was more controlled than anything she'd done 48 hours ago. He nodded back. Velthos was already at the central floor. He stood with the preternaturally precise stillness of the Trethani, a being who had attended more of these sessions than any other currently living species could claim. He did not look at Ethan. He looked at the chamber in general, with the expression or the Trethani equivalent, a particular arrangement of his crystalline facets that Ethan had learned to read over months of someone who had already won, and was managing to restrain his satisfaction to a professional minimum. Jariel was at the Arvakai delegation position, in the first tier, not the central floor. She would not be called to the central floor until the 14C submission was formally introduced. Her face was composed. Her bioluminescence was flat. She did not look at him. He had been directed to a waiting position just outside the chamber's main floor. He would be called when needed. He stood there and listened to the procedural formalities that opened the session vote confirmations, submission registrations, the conclave secretariat cataloging the evidence packages on both sides, and he breathed evenly and thought about nothing that would show up on a biometric scan if one happened to be running. Then Velthos began the summary case. He was, Ethan had to acknowledge, excellent at this. The Grand Arbiter constructed the argument with the precision of an engineer, not emotional, not dramatic, simply logical. The data said humanity was unpredictable. The behavioral patterns showed high emotional volatility. Historical models of similarly classified species showed negative outcome distributions. The mathematics pointed clearly in one direction. He presented this over 45 minutes without raising his voice, without appealing to anything other than the record, and the record, as compiled by the Trethani analytical teams over 3 years, was genuinely comprehensive. Then came the behavioral supplement. Corporal Ewan's incident took 4 minutes in the presentation. Velthos didn't dwell on it. He presented it as 17 data points in a pattern analysis, which in some ways was worse than dwelling on it, because it made it clinical. It made it a number in a distribution rather than a person in a corridor who had just lost her mother. Ethan watched Ewan in the gallery from the corner of his eye. She was very still. Her face was empty in the specific way that faces go empty when the alternative would be visible to 41 species. When Velthos finished, the assembly was quiet in the way large rooms get quiet when everyone in them is thinking the same thing. Then Jariel stood. She walked to the central floor with the same unhurried, deliberate motion she always used, and Ethan watched the assembly watch her. The Arvakai's military capacity was the largest in the known galaxy. Their political influence was proportional. When Jariel of the Arvakai stood at the conclave's central floor, the room's gravitational center shifted in a way that was not metaphorical. The Arvakai Empire submits evidence under Section 14C of the Expanded Rights Framework, she said. The evidence takes the form of biometric assessment of an interspecies relational bond between a provisional observer species national and an Arvakai citizen. A pause. The assessment will be conducted by the conclave apparatus in real time, before the full assembly. The silence shifted. This was clearly not what anyone had expected. Velthus said, Grand Arbiter's protocol requires advanced submission of evidence packages. Section 14C specifically exempts biometric evidence from advanced submission requirements, Jariel said, on the grounds that pre-announcement creates conditions for behavioral manipulation. She held up a physical document, an unusual choice that Ethan recognized as deliberate, a signal to the entire chamber that this was not a data point but a principle. The protocol was established to prevent parties from coaching witnesses prior to assessment. The exemption is on record. Velthos was silent for 2 seconds. In Trithani terms, that was a meaningful pause. The motion is noted. The apparatus will be configured. He turned to his staff and then to the chamber. Cultural, Attachmaro. You will come to the central floor. Ethan walked from the waiting position to the central floor. He was aware of 41 delegations watching him. He was aware of Corporal Ewan in the gallery. He was aware of Jariel standing approximately 3 meters to his right. And he did not look at her. This is the conclave truth assessment apparatus, Velthos said, and a structure descended from the chamber's ceiling, smooth and simple. A ring of what appeared to be polished obsidians surrounding a space approximately 2 meters in diameter, the kind of clean engineering that had been perfected over centuries rather than invented recently. Both parties will stand within the apparatus simultaneously. The assessment will run for 4 minutes. The data will be displayed to the full assembly in real time. Ethan stepped aside. Jariel stepped inside. She was standing close to him, close enough that he could see the bioluminescent patterns along her neck and collarbone, which were still and flat and perfectly controlled. The apparatus will begin in 10 seconds, Velthos said. 10 seconds. The apparatus activated. She had described it as becoming aware of your heartbeat. That was accurate, but insufficient. It was also becoming aware of your breathing, your temperature, the specific electrical activity in every part of your brain that was currently engaged. It was not painful. It was not pleasant. It was the sensation of every private internal fact becoming simultaneously legible and knowing it was legible, and knowing it was being read and finding that the thing you had spent 3 years carefully boxing and organizing was now visible, not as a confession but as a measurement, a verified, classified, annotated measurement. He kept his breathing even. The data was displaying to the assembly in real time. He could see it in the outer ring of the apparatus, rendered in conclave visual language, a series of measurements and classifications that he could partially read from this distance. The bond classification was processing. He could see the 3 criteria populating one by one: non-transactional origin verified, involuntary component verified. He looked straight ahead, and then, in his peripheral vision, something he had prepared himself for but had not prepared himself for: the data stream from Jariel's side of the apparatus. She had told him her data would be included. She had told him that directly, 2 days ago, sitting across the table in her working space. But seeing the apparatus read her biometric profile and display it next to his, in parallel, the 2 streams running simultaneously, was different from being told. Completely different, in the way that knowing you are about to step into cold water and stepping into cold water are different. Her data showed a non-standard physiological response to a specific stimulus, present in the record, flagged as anomalous. The classification was different from his
Arvakai emotional taxonomy, operated on a different framework than the human model, but the conclave apparatus was translating both into its neutral framework.
And what it was showing the assembly, in the neutral language of the apparatus, was this: the stimulus in both data streams was the same stimulus. The proximity logs cross-referenced, the timestamps aligned. 3 years of timestamps, aligned. He kept his breathing even. He thought about absolutely nothing except keeping his breathing even. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. 3 minutes and 50 seconds. 4 minutes. The apparatus deactivated. The sensation faded. The display froze. The chamber was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Velthos looked at the frozen display for a long moment. Then he said,
The behavioral pattern analysis submitted
"This morning demonstrated."
the apparatus has verified the Section 14C criteria, Jariel said.
All three. The C assembly has the data. The behavioral pattern analysis remains on record. I was told, said a voice from the assembly, reedy and whistling through a translation module, that the apparatus was calibrated to a verified standard. It was one of the Prath delegates, the one who had shifted to undecided. If the criteria are met, the Section 14C provision applies as mitigating evidence regardless of other materials submitted. A murmur moved through the assembly in the specific way that murmurs move through large bodies of people when something is shifted that cannot be shifted back. Velthos did not respond immediately. His crystalline facets moved in the configuration Ethan had learned to read. As recalibration, he was changing approach. The provision applies, Velthos said finally. However, the provision constitutes mitigating evidence, not a binding determination. The assembly will still vote. He turned to face the full chamber. The question is whether a single non-transactional bond between one human and one Arvakai constitutes sufficient evidence of species-level relational capacity. He paused. The assembly may find that it does not. He was right. That was the weak point, and Velthos had seen it before Ethan had. One data point. 41 species. And the argument was, this one human. That was not going to be enough. Ethan could feel it, the way you can feel the weight of an argument shifting before anyone has said the decisive word. He spoke before he'd fully decided to. Grand Arbiter, he said. Velthos turned toward him. 41 delegations turned toward him. He was aware of Jariel's slight, almost imperceptible shift of attention beside him. You've characterized the biometric data as evidence of an individual anomaly rather than species-level capacity, Ethan said. I'd like to address that characterization. Velthos said, You are not a recognized speaker in this proceeding. Section 14C allows the subject of the biometric evidence to provide contextual statement, Ethan said. He had found this provision at 2 a.m. 3 days ago in the footnotes. I'd like to provide context. A pause. Velthos checked a small gesture to his staff, a consultation with the conclave legal record that took approximately 15 seconds. Then you may proceed. Ethan looked at the assembly. 41 species. Not a crowd he had ever expected to address. The Grand Arbiter is correct that this apparatus recorded one bond, he said. But I'd ask the assembly to consider what producing that bond required. He kept his voice even, not loud. The acoustics would carry it. I am a human. I was assigned to a foreign species territory without being asked whether I wanted to go. I spent 3 years in an environment where my emotional responses were being continuously monitored and analyzed by systems I was not told about, for purposes I was not informed of, to be used in a proceeding I was not aware was happening. A pause. And what the apparatus just verified is that at the end of those 3 years, what my body chose to do involuntarily, as the apparatus confirmed, was form a non-transactional bond with one of the beings I lived among. He looked at the frozen data display. That is not an anomaly, he said. That is the baseline. That is what humans do. We are surrounded by unknown, and we reach toward it. We cannot help it. We do not know how to stop doing it, and we have never tried. He looked back at the assembly. You cannot calculate that. You cannot predict it, and you absolutely cannot replicate it. Velthos opened his mouth. One more thing, Ethan said, because he had just thought of it and was past the point where stopping felt possible. Corporal Yoon cried in a corridor after her mother died. You included that in your behavioral evidence as an example of emotional volatility that makes humanity unsuitable for galactic society. He looked directly at Velthos. I would like to offer a recharacterization. What Corporal Yoon demonstrated is that humans feel loss as deeply as we feel connection. You cannot have one without the other. That is not a malfunction, that is the same mechanism. He looked at the assembly. If the ability to grieve is what makes us unsuitable, I would suggest, respectfully, that the conclave might want to consider very carefully what it loses when it removes species that are capable of it. He stopped talking. The chamber was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Velthos said, The assembly will deliberate. Ethan stepped back. He was aware that his heart rate was elevated, which the apparatus had just demonstrated was legible to everyone in this room, and he found that he no longer cared. He glanced at Jariel. She was looking at him. The bioluminescence along her jaw pulsed gold, not the brief flash he'd seen before in private corridors, but something that lasted 2 full seconds before she controlled it. 23 members of the assembly had been watching her face when it happened. The deliberation was called. Ethan and Jariel were directed to the waiting area outside the chamber. The door closed behind them. They were alone in the corridor. Ethan said, "I'm sorry. I wasn't supposed to speak." "No," she said. "You were not. Did I make it worse?" She was quiet for 4 seconds. 5. "No," she said. "I do not believe you made it worse." He leaned against the corridor wall and let his legs do what they'd been threatening to do, which was feel less reliable than usual. "The data from your side," he said. "I could see it." The apparatus was displaying it to the chamber. She did not respond. 3 years, he said, time-stamped. The corridor was very quiet. The stars were visible through a narrow observation port, the same stars they always were, indifferent and very far away. "You told me," he said, "that you'd looked at every other option before you came to me with this." "Yes, 47 submissions," he said. 3 years of them. 7 years from when you first read the file." He looked at her. "At what point did you stop calculating and start whatever you want to call it?" The other thing, her bioluminescence shifted. Not the controlled pulse, not the deliberate suppression. Something longer, slower, a shift across the full set of markings along her neck and collarbone, more than he had ever seen from her, sustained in a way that said she was not trying to stop it. "I am not certain," she said, "that those are separable." He looked at her. She looked back. "I know," he said. Before either of them could say anything else, the chamber door opened. Velthos's aide appeared. "The assembly has reached a preliminary position.
Both parties are requested to return."
They went back. The assembly had not voted yet. This was clear from the way the chamber felt when Ethan and Jariel returned, not resolved, not settled, but repositioned. The 41 delegations were in the configuration they used when a session had shifted, but not concluded. Delegations that had been conferring with each other were now separate again, and several had changed their physical positions within their tier sections, which in conclave protocol was a significant indicator of deliberation that had not reached consensus. Velthos stood at the central floor with his crystalline facets arranged in the configuration Ethan had learned, over months, to read as controlled frustration. Good, Ethan thought, with the particular calmness of someone who has already done the most frightening thing they're likely to do today. "The assembly has deliberated," Velthos said, "and has reached a procedural question requiring resolution before the vote can proceed." He turned, and his gaze, if gaze was the right word for a being whose visual processing was distributed across a lattice, moved to the Arvakai delegation. Specifically, the assembly has noted that the biometric data presented by the apparatus included data from both parties simultaneously. The Arvakai party's data showed anomalous response patterns consistent with the same classification detected in the human party. He paused. The assembly would like to understand why this information was not disclosed in advance, given that the Arvakai party was the submitting party and would have been aware of the content of their own biometric record. The chamber was very quiet. Ethan looked at Jariel. "She was very still," Velthos said. "Queen Jariel, this is not a hostile question. The assembly is seeking clarity." She stood. Ethan knew exactly what she was weighing. He could feel the weight of it from where he stood, the way you can feel certain things in people you've watched carefully for long enough. She had brought the 14C evidence to prove humanity's worth. She had not intended to prove her own data alongside it in the way it had appeared. But the apparatus ran paired records because the provision required it, and her data was in the record. And now the assembly had seen it and was asking her to explain it in front of 41 delegations. Her answer would either explain it away as a function of the assessment mechanism or it would not. "The question is fair," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I will answer it directly." She looked at the assembly. "I submitted the biometric evidence knowing that my own physiological record would be included. I believe that the evidence speaks for itself and does not require my commentary." She paused, "But since the assembly has asked, my data shows what it shows. The patterns in my record are present because they are true. I did not attempt to exclude them, and I did not attempt to explain them because they are not relevant to the legal question of humanity's status." Velthos said, "The assembly believes they may be relevant to the credibility of the submitting party." She looked at him steadily. "In what way?" If the submitting party has a personal bond with the subject species, one that meets the criteria of the same provision being invoked, then the assembly has a right to consider whether the submission is motivated by strategic interest or by personal attachment. She held his gaze, and there was a moment brief, but visible to anyone watching her face, where something moved behind the amber facets of her eyes. Then she said, "And if the answer is both?" The chamber was absolutely silent. "My motivations have been consistent for 7 years," she said. "The Arvakai have submitted 47 formal briefs to this assembly arguing for humanity's preservation. Every submission was based on the merits of the case. The evidence I present today is also based on the merits." She paused. "However, if the assembly wants to know whether I have a personal stake in the outcome of this vote, yes, I do. I have had one for longer than Atash Morrow has known I exist." The silence that followed was different from every silence the chamber had produced so far, not uncertainty, not hostility, but the quality of silence that descends when something that everyone in a room was already thinking has been said out loud in clear, unambiguous terms. Velthos looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with a precision that carried no inflection, but that Ethan as something close to recalibration, "The assembly will note the disclosure. A delegate from the Leth contingent, one of the smaller species, a methane breather, whose translator module gave them a reedy whistling voice that somehow always sounded earnest, said, 'I have a question for Atachi Morrow.'" Ethan looked at the delegate. "You spoke earlier about what humans do," the delegate said. "You said, 'We are surrounded by unknown and we reach toward it.' I want to ask you, does that include reaching toward things that may not reach back?" The chamber waited. Ethan looked at the delegate for a moment. Then he looked at Jariel. She was looking at him. Her bioluminescence was doing something he had no word for, yet not the controlled brief flash of gold, not the deliberate suppression. Something sustained and multi-wavelength, the kind of display that moved across the full set of markings, the way weather systems move across a continent, the kind of display that the Arvakai, he was fairly certain, only produced when they had stopped trying to manage what was showing. He looked back at the Leth delegate. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it includes, especially that." The delegate made a sound that the translator rendered as, "Thank you." Velthus said, "The assembly will convene for final deliberation. Parties requested to withdraw." He looked directly at Ethan. "Atash Morrow, you are aware that the statement you made before the full assembly constitutes a formal communication to a conclave proceeding, which will be logged in your diplomatic service record." "I'm aware," Ethan said. "Earth Command will receive a copy." I assumed they would. Velthos regarded him for a moment. The crystalline facets shifted in a way Ethan had never quite seen from him before, not frustration, not dismissal, something that took longer to read, something closer to a fundamental assumption encountering a fact that didn't fit the model. "You are a very unusual diplomat," he said. "I've been told that," Ethan said. They withdrew. The waiting area this time held them for 45 minutes of deliberation. Ethan sat against the wall. Jariel stood by the observation port. Neither spoke for a long time. The stars outside were doing what they always did, and the corridor was warm with the smell of the Arvakai home system. And Ethan sat with both of those facts and found them oddly steadying. Then he said, 47 submissions. She looked at him. 3 years of them, he said, before you ever asked me for anything, before you ever needed me for anything. He looked at his hands. I spent 2 days thinking you were using me, that this was a calculation, that I was a piece in a plan you'd been building since you saw my file. She was quiet, and maybe some of it was, he said. You noticed the biometric flag. You saw an opportunity that happened to exist because of what I felt. You are a very good strategist, and you don't do things without reasons. He looked up at her. But the 47 submissions were before the flag. The file review was 7 years ago, and the submission started 3 years ago, and none of it all started. Because you needed something from me. She turned from the observation port to face him fully. Why did it start? He said. The real answer, not the one about net loss to the galactic system. She was quiet for so long that he thought she would redirect the conversation, the way she had redirected it every time this particular question had gotten close enough to touch. Then she said, because the assessment report was accurate. Humanity's extinction would be a loss, a pause, and because I read your file, and I thought this is a species that produces people like this. People who name their dogs. She stopped. A short, controlled exhale that he recognized as the Arvakai equivalent of someone deciding to say the rest of the sentence. People who grieve loss and keep reaching anyway. People who are sent to foreign places without being asked and find things to love there and do not seem to consider it a waste. He looked at her. That is not a sufficient answer for a conclave proceeding, she said. But you asked why. Yeah, he said quietly. I did. The observation port showed stars. They sat with that for a while. Your Majesty, he said. Jariel, she said. Not a correction. An offer made quietly in a waiting room outside a chamber where 41 species were voting on whether humanity would continue to exist. He looked at her. Jariel, when this is over, whatever the vote is, what happens? I face a review from the Arvakai High Council regarding the undisclosed personal disclosure. She said this without inflection. The disclosure I made in the chamber creates questions about my impartiality in previous conclave matters. There will be an inquiry. That sounds bad. It is manageable, and he paused. Start it again. The disclosure, was it intentional? She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. He nodded. Good, he said. A pause. Why good? Because it means something surprised you, he said. I like it when something surprises you. She looked at him for a long moment. Her bioluminescence in the private corridor with no witnesses and no apparatus was doing the sustained multi-wavelength thing. Again, the display she'd produced in the chamber. Still present, not being managed back down. He was going to need to find a word for it. He had several candidates, and none of them felt adequate yet. You are a very unusual person, she said. I've been told that too, he said. The chamber door opened. Ethan stood. Jariel straightened. They walked back in. Velthos was at the central floor. He looked older, somehow, though the Trithani didn't age visibly. It was something in his posture, the quality of someone who has just been through something that didn't go the way they expected and has not yet fully integrated the experience. Ethan recognized that quality. He had felt it himself on a number of occasions, most recently about 48 hours ago. The Assembly has voted, Velthos said. The final count, 23 against reclassification, 15 for, 3 abstentions. He paused in a way that was clearly deliberate, a practiced pause. The motion for Grade 5 reclassification fails to achieve the 2/3 threshold. Another pause, shorter. Humanity retains its provisional observer status. The review period is extended, and a formal reevaluation will occur in 12 years. The Assembly thanks all parties for their participation in this proceeding. 23-15. Ethan stood on the central floor of the conclave assembly chamber and thought, 23. He thought about 41 species, watching Jariel's bioluminescence pulse gold for 2 seconds, sustained and uncontrolled, in front of everyone, and about what that had cost her, and about what it had moved. He thought about Corporal Yuan in the gallery. He thought about 47 submissions that no one had asked for, beginning before he existed in this context, continuing through 3 years of a connection being measured and logged and carefully not discussed. He thought about what 23 votes felt like when, 12 hours ago, he had estimated 11. He turned and looked at Jariel. She was looking at the assembly, not at him, the composed queen, the face that showed nothing, except the bioluminescence along her jaw, just barely, just for a second, in the way it did in corridors with no witnesses, gold. He looked away before anyone else could see him notice. They rode the transit tube back to the Vorath Khan in a group. Jariel, her staff, Ethan, Corporal Yoon, who had materialized at the transit tube entrance without him fully registering how. Yoon walked beside him and said nothing until they were halfway through the tube, and then she said, You mentioned my mother. I did. I didn't know you were going to do that. Neither did I, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Did it help? I think so. Good, she said. Then after a moment you're going to be in trouble with Earth Command. Probably, he said. Was it worth it? He thought about this. He thought about the specific answer to this question, which he knew clearly, and which he was not going to say out loud in a transit tube with 17 other people. Yes, he said. She nodded, satisfied, and they rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. The debrief took 3 hours. Jariel met with her senior counsel in the private chambers behind the veil. Ethan met with the Earth diplomatic staff who had attended as gallery witnesses. 2 of them were already on communication with Earth Command before he'd sat down. The debrief was professional and thorough, and ended with the senior Earth attaché telling him that Earth Command wanted him to report for a full review at the earliest possible transition date, which both of them understood to mean he was going to have a difficult few months when he got back. He said understood. After the debrief, he walked back to his quarters and sat at his desk and looked at the stars and thought about 12 years, the duration of the extended review period, the timeline before the conclave formally reconsidered humanity's status. 12 years is to build a record. 12 years to produce evidence in whatever forms the conclave would accept. 12 years to do in formal daylight what had been done in secret for the past 3. He wondered if Earth Command would leave him here for that. He doubted it. He was still sitting at his desk, thinking about this, when the light in his quarters shifted in a way that was not the standard curfew cycle, a soft pulse, almost a knock. He looked at the door. No one else on the ship had that access code. He opened the door. Jariel stood in the corridor, not in formal mantle, in the plainer dress of the palace interior, the kind of clothes she wore in the working space, the kind that existed for function rather than presentation. Her bioluminescence was, for the first time he could remember seeing it outside of a contained private space, openly unsuppressed, a full pattern, slow and varied, the colors moving across the markings along her neck and collarbone, with the natural rhythm of something that had been held in place for too long and was now allowed to move. She was not performing stillness. The High Council review is scheduled for next week, she said. My staff is preparing the response brief. How bad will it be? Manageable, she said. As I said. And you came to tell me that. No, she said. She looked at him steadily. I came to answer your question. The one you asked in the waiting corridor, she said. When this is over, what happens? He waited. I do not know, she said. I have been very certain about many things for a very long time, and I am currently not certain about this. She paused. That is an unusual experience for me. Does it feel good? She considered this for a genuinely long moment, not performing consideration, actually doing it. No, she said. It feels significant, which is not the same thing. No, he agreed. It's not. They stood in the doorway. The corridor was warm and quiet. The air carrying the faint mineral scent of the palace interior, the specific smell he had never stopped associating with here rather than somewhere else, with this rather than elsewhere. I named my dog Meridian, he said, because I liked the idea of something that could tell you where you were, give you a fixed point. He paused. When she died, I didn't have one for a long time. I didn't realize how much I'd been using her for that until she was gone. She looked at him. Her bioluminescence continued its slow, unsuppressed movement, the full pattern, nothing held back. You are, she said, carefully, in the conclave record as a verified non-transactional bond. The apparatus confirmed it. I know. The records are now part of Conclave Archive. They will not be expunged. I know that too. So the question of whether I need to ask you something or you need to ask me something becomes. Jariel, he said. She stopped. You read my file 7 years ago, he said. You submitted 47 briefs before you met me. You sat on the floor in front of an image of the Oregon coast, and you knew the name of my dog, and you stood in front of 41 species and told them that you had a personal stake in this vote. He looked at her. I think we're past the point of asking. She was quiet for 2 full seconds. Yes, she said, I believe we are. The stars, through the distant port at the end of the corridor, did nothing but what they always did, existed and were very far away, the same ones that looked different, depending on where you were standing when you looked at them. Ethan had looked at them from Portland and from Earth Command briefing rooms, and from the diplomatic corps of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy. And they had always been the same stars, and always looked different. And the difference was never the stars. I should go, she said. The brief requires. I know, he said. She nodded. She turned to go. Then she turned back. Atash Moro, she said. Ethan, he said. I think we're past that too. Her bioluminescence pulsed full gold, sustained, not an accident and not a performance, just a fact about her that she was allowing to be visible. And then she walked away down the corridor, and he watched her go, and the stars kept doing what stars do, and he went inside and sat at his desk. For the first time in 3 years, or maybe 7, he did not feel the particular weight of a thing he'd been carrying without a name for it. He knew what it was called now. He just needed to figure out what to do with it. The answer, he suspected, was the same as it had always been. He reached toward it.